Okay, this is lecture number 7, Ethics and Aesthetics. I want to try to breeze through this quickly because the notion of ethics can be kind of abstract and very unrooted and very dry. And I'm going to try to see if I can make this a little more practical and down to earth and less philosophical. I'll kind of go through some of the readings or touch on them very briefly, but try to tell some examples and some stories about how they make practical sense later on in this lecture. But first, I wanted to recap the arc of the last few lectures. We haven't actually gone through the ecological section, but this arc through phenomenology into ethics is maybe best summarized by this excerpt from the Carsten Harries reading, which is to really trace also the history that we have covered through postmodernism, to try to get away from an aestheticized consumer model of architecture back to a repositioning of it as an act of building, an act of dwelling, or more essential notions of space, form, and light, but also understanding it as a social service more squarely in the mold of early modernism's idealism. And so here, this part, second paragraph that Carsten Harries, I'll let you guys kind of read it, as we kind of go through, is trying to get back to the reconciliation of an intrinsic notion of architecture, supremely attached from the political and the social dimensions. This is not to try to be, very high-minded, but really to go back to the first readings from Alain de Botton, right? In What Style Shall We Build? This idea that I've highlighted here, that buildings are really speaking to our deep-seated notions of happiness and how we live, those things that actually sustain us, rather than just the way things look and appear. And this idea is probably very self-evident to you guys now as architecture shifts, or has been shifting over the last 20 years towards a more essential and more engaged, socially engaged role. But to understand its susceptibility as a tool of complicity, as René de Graaf goes into later on in this section. Likewise, Carsten Harries is trying to position, in this essay, Thoughts on a Non-Arbitrary Architecture, the places where architecture, even in 2021, has the vulnerability of becoming less socially engaged and more aesthetically oriented for a whole host of reasons. And this thesis that he places, back in the late 80s and early 90s, both in this essay from Perspecta, as well as his book, The Ethical Function of Architecture, the highlight section right here, Heidegger understands genuine building as an interpretation of a more original being in the world, that strengthens man's natural sense of place. That recalls, not just the Frampton and Zonist understanding of regionalism, but also, in a more universal sense, the Norberg-Schultz idea of sense of place. And to maybe summarize all of Harry's position, the position that I interpret him as taking is that it's not just a theoretical issue. It's not just a matter of building, but the ethical problem of architecture is really the core of what drives the resolution of architecture to be more of an agent of change. And going over very quickly, this is excerpts from his book, The Ethical Function of Architecture. But he refers to Nicholas Pevsner, as some of you may have encountered in previous history and theory classes, that in contrast to the aesthetic approach, the ethical approach tries to approach not just a particular moral or ethical position, but to articulate a common platform of social, agreements, and I think that is where I've been trying to make this proposition that and best captured by this essay in Architecture Review by René de Graaf, who is both an author and social critic, architecture critic, as well as a partner at OMA. Really tries to go into the crisis that architecture in this point in time is still struggling with an increasing lack of agency or independence or effectivity in a social dimension. As you kind of read through this, I'll kind of just try to summarize the two key points from his article, that this has actually been a long arc and struggle in the history of modernism, that capitalism has actually overtaken architecture's role or modernism's role, and the struggle to be able to recapture its ethical position really starts to make some hard choices, not just for us as architects, but also from the entire construction and political hierarchy, vertically aligned. And so, this later segment from the same article by de Graaf is exactly what I would say Hal Foster is really saying, highlighted in red, right? In that sense, there may ultimately be no such thing as modern or postmodern architecture, but simply architecture before and after its annexation by capital, which is Hal Foster's position at the end of modernism, saying it's not a finished exercise, but his critique of modernism and postmodernism really are the same critique, which is trying to get back to a more fundamental understanding of its role as more engaged socially. And so, at this last sentence here, and I think this article is actually on Laulima, but our modern architecture's economy of means is no longer a way to reach the largest number of people, but a way to maximize profits. The two images on the right? I mean, and not to be, too pointed, a critic, locally of, these buildings, but the distance between, the position and, somewhat, failure of Yamasaki's Pruitt Igoe, above, and then what de Graaf is critiquing as a certain aestheticized modernism down below, as a way to really profit or create a certain kind of an affiliation, and then going back to the Hal Foster part that we first engaged, seeking to question rather than exploit cultural codes, to explore rather than conceal social and political affiliations. The making transparent of these operations and mechanisms by which architecture is constructed, developed, and profited from aesthetically is kind of the position that I think this section I'm very interested in exploring, where in our section, I guess some of you guys might remember from the section on regionalism, we posited that this is an opening up, right? Regionalism is an opening up of a previous modernism, an off-ramp from postmodernism to really get into, these 5 different, among others, not limited to, but these 5 issues on that actually then kind of create a platform or a palette within which a much broader and freer exploration of architecture in this century is able to endeavor. Now, one could also make this argument, and I think this is Carson Harry's point, is the ethics of architecture is actually the paradigm, and not necessarily regionalism or modernism or postmodernism. I think his point is that the ethic position is the lens through which all of these issues on the right are applied to be able to return to a more fundamental and more effective role of architecture. And what I would like to posit to you guys is whether, accept it or reject it as a position, how by examining that potential, that actually might help to create your own, to be not too cheesy, this architecture of your own happiness, right? Both professionally as well as in the products of your own design and the occupants that may inhabit your designs. And going very quickly, through these next set of slides, which is really just to underscore the fact that the AIA has really canonized the ethical obligations of architecture in a pretty extensive document, lest anyone think that the ethical dimension of architecture is an option and not necessarily a requisite. And in these different canons that are you can find them on the AIA website, but the reason why I kind of want to kind of put this out there is because you can probably find a counterpart to a hot button issue that is directly addressed or conceived as addressing the dimension of architecture to be able to attack and make relevant itself to current social crises. And then well, kind of like trying to breeze through this part again, lifted from the AIA Code of Ethics, but I do want to kind of put out these 2 particular highlights. One is obligations to colleagues, and obligations to the environment, particularly in this time of the way in which we see architecture and the very difficult choices that practitioners make in accepting or declining commissions, which is a matter of self-interest, I think, or acting against one's professional self-interest in favor of a broader common interest socially. And here, right, this article from the AIA Journal, this particular chapter recognizes that the history and the tendency of incarceration, both as a private profitability issue, but also the disproportionate incarceration of minorities becomes a particular ethical problem for architects choosing to perpetuate this mode of political structure. And then, again, these sections of sustainability, this section from, the Canon 4, ES 2.4, the immediate relevancy and sort of almost the late urgency for architecture to actually start to address climate change to the point that where we're really trying to address resiliency and disaster damage control as much as carbon footprint, and reversing climate change. But predominantly, this younger generation of which you guys are part of, relative to an establishment, really becomes, hopefully, becomes aware to you guys that, the matter of ethical effort and engagedness becomes a legacy for the younger generation, more so in their self-interest than the older generation of establishment. And in shifting track, a little slightly, this idea of, the corporate monopoly, here I'm kind of referring to a Netflix documentary called Social Dilemma, for this notion of public action and public space. And we'll try to kind of make a little bit of a preface here into both, upcoming sections on, material versus digital, and technology. And granted, the technology of social media is in some ways a digital or virtual public realm, but in the same way that architecture has been commodified over the last 100 years, and maybe some would argue even further back. This fellow on the right, Tristan Harris, as a ethicist, his title is a self-proclaimed technological ethicist, and you can refer to. I would encourage you guys, as a bathroom diversion. An interview, if you Google, Tristan Harris, Trevor Noah, right, and watch this YouTube video where on the Daily Show, Trevor Noah and Harris go through, and unpack the specific pitfalls of technology, or relying on technology in a non-critical manner, and how that actually starts to create some of the political crises, right, that we find ourselves in now. This is a 2016 electoral map, but I would argue that the 2020, I kind of posted this actually a couple of years ago, but the 2020 electoral map, as influenced by social media, misinformation, and so on, becomes even more skewed, more polarized in the way that it frames the misinformation of public space in favor of a corporate agenda, corporate profit, but also in a ominous way, the rebranding of Facebook towards Meta becomes this foreshadowing of the same way in which a corporate interest starts to monopolize a particular, the aesthetic of daily public life, without, an ethical obligation. How does this get back to, the decisions that we make daily, and the decisions that you guys make as you guys get into a professional and try to find the work or jobs that you find fulfilling, that kind of gets you into the places that you want to be, what you want to be doing. And a personal story, I'll kind of share this a little bit, which is about 20 years ago, I was in New York. I was looking for a job. I interviewed with Richard Meyer's office, and for those of you that may not be familiar with his work, being, this architect, of this group called the New York Five, developed this kind of white architecture. The very famous Smith House in the upper image, lower image, a high rise for Kaka'ako that got shelved, in favor of, the Studio Gang project going up now. But this article from the New York Times here, and I'll, let you Google that for the full excerpt, by Stella Liu, who actually worked in Meyer's office many years ago, and tells the story of her, Me Too sexual harassment experience that led to the resignation and the retirement of Richard Meyer from his own namesake firm. And I would add, subsequently the the slow motion, disintegration of the leadership there and departure for other firms. The personal story that I share here was that while not taking this position, I ended up at another firm where I encountered and got to know a work colleague who came from Meyer's office. And this was back in 2003, and 20 years before this story, really broke, she said that, there were common stories that were floating around the office of this principal, Richard Meyer, sexually harassing his employees and having to have a restraining order and some employee practices to prevent further harassment, which evidently did not work. And so this personal anecdote that I share here, in this other this article, which is kind of really saying why is the professional obligation to colleagues not working in architecture. And what I think this article does the highlight, and as much as the Me Too movement does highlight, is that this the favoring or I would say fixation, on the aesthetic over the ethic, really becomes problematic as it starts to encounter workplace environments if it is not placed front and center as the driving force behind the projects that we take on. And so you kind of go back to Alain de Botton's article, right? About right here, this middle paragraph. Arguments about what is beautiful emerge are no easier to resolve, but then again, no harder than disputes about what is wise or right. And we try to publicly explain, those kind of debates about, political agendas, people ideas, but also the things, much as buildings, those things that are either desirable or offensive. And I think they're all kind of wrapped up into the same question of how do we actually get back to a more effective, professional posture as well as a workplace, posture. Peter Turchin's book, Ages of Discord, in some ways start to articulate the social trend here. This is a little bit of a wordy summary of his book, where the social bonds that are kind of coming unglued in our current times, relative to a certain kind of a not just political polarization, but wealth inequity, are perhaps, I would argue, and that Rayner de Graaf article argues that this intersecting decline and incline of political stress in the red, and the the political social glue, as it were, kind of on decline, are directly related to, I would say, this polarization in wealth and economic inequity. And again, I think to kind of back up a little bit, this excerpt, from a couple years ago, where the aesthetic of Kaka'ako, in the service of creating a certain valuation, of Howard Hughes, in a position for it to be sold off as a profitable asset, and less as the making of public space that has some sort of longevity or placemaking depth to it, I would critique fairly, is part of the large question of the trying to make visible the political machinery that is happening behind the making of architecture, even in our own city. We'll kind of get into hopefully a little bit of this in an upcoming section on urban form, and its politics. But so what do we do, right? What's the hope to look forward to in both of our our professional trajectories? And so a series of examples, right, models here, one being Sam Mockbee, everybody kind of knows, in the reframing of not just his practice and his education in the rural studio, to be able to focus on not the luxurious clients that many architects crave, but the underserved and underprivileged, and so it is not without its sacrifices, but the reframing of the ethical role of the architect, as envisioning this as part of the democratic process, is Sam Mockbee's primary thesis. One could actually kind of point to other models, like this is the artist residency project that Toshiko Mori undertook in Senegal, to be able to cultivate a place for women to safely develop their art, as well as develop new trade avenues by which Senegal might actually develop its own independent and self-sustaining cottage industries, undertaken as a pro bono project. And so the global architect role here, in the service of reinterpreting local traditions, right? Right here you have that sort of the regional approach. You have the tectonic traditions, of making, of weaving, of local materials, of common methods of non-Cartesian geometry, or mass design group. Again, the potential now of a global practice that actually focuses the, as Diane Girardo would put it, the constituencies that the architect creates for themselves beyond its immediate reach. That those are the opportunities that we all have now, that maybe were in a previous generation reserved for the architect privy to the corporate client. And now I think the tools of social media, as much as the connectivity, technical and technological connectivity of a global culture, allows us to ply our services in ways that might reverse the inequity geographically and politically. I do want to kind of just wrap up quickly. In a project, for example, another project that Norman Foster undertook years ago, which is the restoration of the Reichstag, which is the government building, the parliament building for Germany, and this idea that in trying to hit multiple criteria at the same time, right? And in some ways, like the midterm exercise that I had you guys undertake, for our state capital, him trying to attack this building as a symbol of multiple levels of ethical engagement, the democratic, accessibility, a recorrection, a reframing of the history, of this building that really set the stage for Hitler's rise, and the environmental or sustainable performative metrics that this building, both in its mechanical systems, but also integrated into its architectural systems of daylighting, of public access and transparency, of engagement of the citizenry into the political operation of the lawmaking. All these multiple issues operating at simultaneously becomes an ideal, if it as it were, condition for architecture to strive for. And I think that's what, to kind of leave this on a more hopeful note, I think Diane Girardo, doesn't necessarily leave, this essay, but, written back in the 1990s, but still relevant, as relevant now as it is back then, trying to grapple for some kind of an optimism or a hopeful sign. And I think this last section or paragraph from this page, both as a downer, right? There are these powerful myths, that directly, address these kind of problems, right? These inherent problems, of architecture, the architect and client, that already does not favor the architect on a level playing field. But again, right here, right, in order to maneuver successfully, the professional needs to give some serious thought to renew and refashioning its ideological premise. And then further down, right, there's no shortage of possible subjects: the homeless, individuals and families excluded from a real estate market, communities threatened by decay or development, inadequate housing. Identifying these ideal clients is an important first step towards creating this discourse adequate to the enormous tasks, by the profession. And I want to leave that as much a relevant charge for now as much as it was 20 years ago, which is to say that the tasks and obstacles here are daunting, but they are worthwhile being framed front and center over the aestheticization of architecture. What we'll do in an upcoming, the next lecture, is really start to get into the nuts and bolts, both literal as well as figurative, of material and technical assembly in architecture, and how the concept of the ethical actually pervades those areas in trying to help identify strategies and categories of action to be able to understand conceptually, the notion of detailing, of technical resolution, and even the notion of digital form and digital process of building. So.